Time's Person of the Year is Donald Trump. Who else? We know what Trump does. Do we know who Trump is? Tonight, inside the mind of the man who has turned much of our world on its head. I'm Brent Goff, and this is The Day.
Well, it's a very humbling experience, I can tell you.
I think he feels personally quite vindicated, but it's really important to remember that Person of the Year is not a trophy. Upending American norms of civility.
It's the most incredible place on earth, most incredible place ever.
And anticipating a much larger shift in the global political order as well.
And we were losing that, and I don't want to lose that.
More than half the country, at least judging by the popular vote, find him to be an incredibly destructive and potentially dangerous force.
These are great people. These are people that built this country, and they've been forgotten.
Well, welcome to the program, everyone. The attack on Pearl Harbor, 75 years later, and history is still being written. Tonight, you'll meet two authors helping to right a major wrong about what we know of that day in infamy. That's coming up later in the show. We begin the day with Donald Trump's face on the cover and his footprint on the world. Today, the editors at Time magazine named U.S. President-elect Donald Trump Person of the Year. No big surprise there. Just ask yourself, when you think back over all of 2016, which name, more than any other, comes to mind? Well, this is Time's 90th Person of the Year. Now, Trump joins a long list of people impacting the world. Last year, it was the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel. And the title is not meant as an award or a commendation. There have been some very good people, some not so good, and some downright evil figures. Adolf Hitler was once Person of the Year. And as a rule, every president of the United States, with a couple of exceptions, has been named Person of the Year in the year they first win the White House. In that regard, Donald Trump is in line with tradition, something we can almost never say about the man.
Every year we choose the Person of the Year, who is the individual who has had the most influence on events, for better or worse. It's hard to argue that anyone had more influence than Donald Trump over the events of this year.
You know, I didn't get Beyonce and Jay-Z and Bruce Springsteen to get crowds. I had just me and ideas that people wanted to hear.
But there's a profound argument about whether his influence was for the better or for the worse. And that really is the challenge that faces him. The country came through this election season more divided conspicuously, publicly, than at any time through any election cycle that most of us can remember. One of the things that was remarkable in going to see him, to interview him, is to be in that penthouse, which is the most ostentatious, imaginable marble and mirrors and gold, and see him in the suit and the diamond cufflinks. There's a kind of dissonance that we pressed him about, of how is it that the billionaire is the tribune of the working man? He said he thought that it had to do with that he wasn't a phony, that there have certainly been wealthy politicians before him who in some cases would bend over backwards to make themselves appear like the common man, or do anything that they could, eating the corn dog at the Iowa State Fair and wearing a flannel shirt in New Hampshire. I think he had a very strong instinct that his wealth and the flamboyant display of his wealth was not a liability, that it was actually an asset.
Well, it's a very humbling experience, I can tell you, as somebody that loves this country. It's a very large country, but it's also a even more powerful country than the numbers, because if you look at China and India, and you have others with more people, but when you look at what we do in this country, it's the most incredible place on earth.
A lot of people think that Person of the Year, just because the nature of the name, is an honor. And certainly there have been years where we have recognized people whose influence has been altogether unassailably worthy. Normally, that's not the case. I know there are a lot of people who disagree with so much of what Donald Trump said and are very apprehensive about what his presidency means for them and for the country. I think I would challenge them to suggest that someone else this year had more influence and in a way a greater surprise than what he did in 2016.
So how did he do it? Well, I'm joined now by Dan McAdams. He is recognized around the world as a leader in personality psychology. One reason is the book and psychological portrait that he wrote about a different U.S. president, George W. Bush. Mr. McAdams joins me from Northwestern University, just north of Chicago. It's good to have you on the day. Thanks for taking the time to talk with us. Back in the summer, you wrote a piece on the mind of Donald Trump. Now, before we talk about, your conclusions there, I just want to ask you, if you were going to write that piece today, you've had, 6 months more, would you change anything about that portrait?
I might change a few things. I think I would emphasize more some of his authoritarian tendencies and the way in which he relates to his followers. I think that was a little less obvious back in the spring when I wrote the piece. But the overall contours, I think I'd stay with what I wrote.
The thing that struck me when I was reading what you had written, we hear more and more since Election Day, we hear him compared with Ronald Reagan. And you wrote that more so than Ronald Reagan, Donald Trump is cognizant that he is always acting, that it even makes him superhuman because he's even evolved further than the rest of us. Explain that to me. If he's acting, then is he ever real?
That's a great question. I don't know if he's evolved further than the rest of us, but there is something about being with him that people report. It's as if they are with a person playing Donald Trump. But is it really Donald Trump? Well, yeah, indeed, it is Donald Trump playing Donald Trump. He has this way of being, this persona that's so occupies the stage that I think at the end of the day, you have to conclude that the persona, the actor you see, that is who he is. And even in the case of Ronald Reagan, they used to say that, but Reagan, there was something behind Reagan. There was a value system. There was a set of goals. With Trump, it's very difficult to find something behind the mask. The actor is overwhelming on the stage.
And I mean, if he's always acting, then isn't he almost always lying? I mean, the man, regardless of what your politics are, the facts are, he has a problem telling the truth a lot of the time.
Well, it's true he has a problem telling the truth. I mean, they've actually got data on that. PolitiFact analyzed all the discourse of the various presidential candidates, and he was something like 74% of his statements are just outright false. And I think that's continued even after he won the election. But I don't think you have to be lying when you're an actor. I mean, I think that's an add-on. I mean, it's part of the role that he has. He's always trying to win. He's always trying to sell you something and convince you. And whatever will work in the moment, he will resort to that tactic, even if it's completely a departure from the truth. And then, 5 minutes later, he'll be on to something else. So it's pretty uncanny how he's able to seize the moment and do what needs to be done in the moment to win the moment. And then he moves on to a different moment.
Do you think he is a person who has fun? I mean, I know you've written that you've never seen anyone who went into a political campaign with as much gusto as Trump did this year, but did it really look like he was having fun campaigning?
I think he enjoyed campaigning, most of it. I think he may not find the presidency to be so fun. I mean, most presidents have reported once they get in office that they didn't realize how many constraints there are upon you, the various checks and balances in the system and so forth, and the way in which, while you're the most powerful person in the world, perhaps, it's not what you think it might be. It'll be very interesting to see how Donald Trump maneuvers once he's actually in the Oval Office and faces those constraints. I don't think he'll find it to be fun.
And how do you predict? I mean, I'm not a psychologist. If someone were to ask me to predict someone's behavior, What I would do is I would look at their past behavior. And with Donald Trump, he seems to be someone who is not very, you've written about it, is not very agreeable. And in fact, I think you wrote there's never been a U.S. president who is so overtly disagreeable on the public stage as Donald Trump. So, I mean, if he's a cantankerous curmudgeon a lot of the time, what is that going to mean for his decisions about domestic and foreign policy?
Well, there's two answers to that. First of all, with respect to the trait of agreeableness or the fact that he's so disagreeable, they've rated all the presidents on this fundamental trait. It's important in all societies. How kind, caring, humble, and empathic are you? Donald Trump scores off the map on the other direction. There just has never been anybody like this in the office with that kind of temperament. So there's no reason to believe that that won't continue. But the other answer to your question goes to your interesting observation that, when we try to predict what people are going to do, we want to look at what they've done in the past, and I would add what they have done in the same situation in the past. And with respect to Donald Trump, we have no data. He has never held a public office. That's extraordinarily unusual to have a president come in like that. So we don't know how he's going to behave. I mean, he certainly will be disagreeable. There's no doubt about that. He'll have a lot of energy. He'll be a dynamo. He'll be trying to win all the time. But that's pretty general. I mean, like, what kind of decisions will he make? How will he occupy the Oval Office? He's never had anything like this before. So it remains a mystery. And I have to say something of a scary mystery as to predict how he will act once he's in the office. I mean,
when he is telling the public that he believes in America and that he believes in the Constitution, from your professional point of view, is he telling people the truth that is constant in him, or is he just giving them a snapshot of what is truthful for him at that moment?
He's giving them the moment as he understands it. Donald Trump has no idea what the Constitution is about. I mean, a few months ago, he spoke to a group of Republicans in Congress, and they asked him, Mr. Trump, will you defend Article 1 of the Constitution, which gives Congress the sole power to make laws? He goes, sure, I'll defend the entire Constitution, even the 12th article. Well, there is no 12th article in the Constitution. I mean, Donald Trump does not have an understanding of the Constitution. I mean, that's clear. As far as truth-telling goes, some people have said we're in a post-truth era here with respect to Mr. Trump. I don't know if I want to go that far, but I mean, it's pretty extraordinary. And it's gotten to the point even where his followers depend on him not telling the truth because some of the things he says they don't like. For example, many of the people who voted for him don't want him to take away Obamacare. They don't want 20 million people suddenly to be without health care insurance here. But they kind of say, well, he said that, but he doesn't really mean it. And so we're in this weird game where even his supporters assume that much of the time he's lying, but that's okay because they like the persona. They like the strength. They like the kind of role he plays.
Yeah, and we asked you on the show to help us get this portrait, a psychological portrait of the man Donald Trump. Let me ask you: can we extrapolate that? Can we talk about a psychological portrait of a nation or of a constituency? Then, if we're talking about Trump's people, because we've got big elections coming up here in Europe next year, and you've got a lot of political leaders who are worried that the Trump train is going to stop in their capital with victory. I mean, can we diagnose a country with being, I don't know, disagreeable or narcissistic?
Yeah, it's hard to diagnose a country. And let's not forget that, he got 2.5 million fewer votes than his opponent. He happened to win by virtue of the Electoral College. I mean, 62 million Americans voted for this man, and they each had their own reason. Many of those people are very good people. They're not especially disagreeable people, but they found something in Donald Trump to admire. It might be that they saw him as a spokesperson for people who've never had a spokesperson before. It might be that certain people saw him as pushing this nostalgic idea that we can be the way we were back in the 1950s, as kind of like crazy as that is, because we're never going back to that. So I think it's very difficult to diagnose the country. I think there is, however, a troubling trend whereby I think people on all sides of the political spectrums, on both sides, come to doubt the truthfulness of candidates and come to doubt the institutions and so forth. There is this backlash against establishment figures and this idea of institutions invested with authority. He's anti-institution, but now he's the president. So, I mean, where do you go with that? I mean, he's occupying the executive position and he's part of the institution now. He's part of the establishment. It's going to be very interesting, I think, to see how he moves forward.
And it will be interesting. I'm already looking forward to the book you're going to write, Mr. McAdams, The Psychological Portrait of President Donald Trump. Dan McAdams joining us from Northwestern University. Mr. McAdams, thank you much. Thank you very much for being on the day. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well, no big surprise. Time Magazine's choice is rather controversial around the world, especially on social media. Take a look. The magazine shows Trump with the M. Now, you have to look closely with the M around his head, suggesting devil's horns, with the headline, President of the Divided States of America. Lots of tweeters want to clarify that Person of the Year is not a popularity contest. The UK student Tom Willett writes, remember, Time's Person of the Year is based on impact and success and not how many people like them. Previous title holders included Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin. But that has not stopped Mr. Trump's vice presidential-elect mate, Mike Pence, from heaping praise on his boss, as you see right there. The American activist Peter Dow wrote that it's amazing how conservatives in my timeline bash the mainstream media until Trump gets Time's Person of the Year. Then they gloat about it. Trump evidently is a huge fan of the publication, as demonstrated in this tweet from 2013. He wrote, Time Magazine's list of the 100 most influential people is a joke and a stunt of a magazine that will, like Newsweek, soon be dead. He called it a bad list.